Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talked to Sara Greenhalgh, a program manager at Edot Midwest Regional Jewish Racial Justice Collaborative. We talk about a new program she launched for Mayyim Hayyim Living Waters Community Mikveh, her work for Edot, and dealing with racism in the Jewish community as a Jew of color on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Sara Greenhalgh, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to meet you.
It's great to meet you as well. We've been talking before I actually hit record, so we're going to do some of this over again. But it was fascinating conversation. The thing that is really interesting to me is that you are sort of this jack of all trades, if you will, in terms of the work that you're doing. It all sort of fits in the box, certainly a big box of racial justice in a way and activism. But, you know, you're doing a project, for starters, with Mayyim Hayyim, the Living Waters Community Mikveh network, where you're leading a project collecting the stories of Jewish women who are BIPOC and Jews of color, Indigenous, Sephardi, and Mizrahi. I don't know how to pronounce that acronym, so I just decided to say the whole thing.
Some say jockism.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess let's start with that project. How did you first get involved with Living Waters and this storytelling project?
Yeah, absolutely. I applied and met with Rabbi Amalia Mark, and we talked for a really long time about like the power of storytelling, the power of relationship building, how all of these things are going to come into play when amplifying the voices of Jewish women of color, and getting really, really expansive on what this project could even be. So yeah, I got involved also largely because of my work with Edot.
Okay.
And being a program manager there and really wanting to stay within the same vein of racial justice work within the Jewish community. I think obviously racial justice work as a whole and racial equity work is incredibly important. I also think that doing it in the Jewish community is a very, very different skill set. And understanding the Jewish community when it comes to racial equity is something very different. One thing that I've liked to do consistently is do projects that are centering JOCs.
Okay.
So like for Edot, our entire team are JOCs. And so we really get to figure out and define what that looks like and what like reparations look like in that context. But then with this project, it's specifically mostly women and non-binary people. But what interests me is not only the work that Mayyim Hayyim has already done, but that they're intentionally really trying to build up and center Jewish women of color and create programs that are made by and for Jewish women of color.
As this project this project is just the storytelling and ritual creation project, which is called Let Justice Well Up. This new initiative has just sort of gotten ramped up. What type of feedback have you been getting from people, submissions or whatnot in these early days so far?
Yeah, so we've been getting a lot of really great feedback so far from the community. So it's a two-part project. Me as the project manager is in charge of the storytelling and ritual creation. And then there's also a Torah series that's being led by Erica Riddick, who's a Chicago-based Black Jewish woman. And so combining both of these is bringing together, with her work, really pulling out the stories that are happening in the Torah series and honing in on them and saying like, this is something that is important to Jewish women of color. How do we expand upon that? How does it relate to Mikveh? And that's been getting a really great response. There are a lot of people signed up for the Torah series, which is starting this Sunday. And I think there's always this question of like a white organization, but a white experiencing organization with largely white experiencing Jews. There's sometimes a question of like, oh, well, why are you making the Jews of color work on it instead of, I think that there's that question that's kind of come up that I've gotten that like personally that I've gotten that has been like, why are you choosing to do this work? And I think that's ultimately the question.
You bring up an interesting point, or I guess people have brought up to you an interesting point. And I'm wondering how you yourself as a Jew of color, how you sort of both feel about that question and how do you answer that question? Because I think I understand the point they're coming from, but obviously as a Jew of color yourself, this topic certainly resonates with you. Otherwise you wouldn't be leading this project.
And I think that's the huge part about doing this work is that there is a large amount of trauma involved in racial equity work, specifically for BIPOC. There's a large amount of trauma when it comes to experienced racism in Jewish communities. But there are JOCs who are willing and wanting to do this work and are stepping up and have stepped up for for decades now and said that this is important. Working within largely white organizations, even with Edot, I think consent is a huge part, is that we are consenting to do this work. We are saying that we want to. We are putting ourselves up front, and not all JOCs do. And that is completely fine. That, like, absolutely, for JOCs who don't want to do this work, that is just as valid as, like, doing this work. I think the last 10 years have been greatly impactful in terms of we've been able to build our JOC community. We're not dealing with a trauma alone anymore. We're able to go to JOCs or JOC organizations. We're able to find our JOC community and like be very fulfilled in that way, and not have to deal with a lot of the, to be honest, bullshit that like some white organizations give to us. And at the same time, that work still needs to be done. I
think that's also, and it's an interesting sort of area to explore a bit, because I know it's not the job of, as has been said a lot in the almost 2 years since George Floyd's murder, it's not the job of the oppressed,
yes,
to educate the oppressor. On the other hand, I think there are those, certainly not to speak on behalf of all white presenting Jews, but I think there are those of us who would like to learn more, but are either uncomfortable asking for help or not sure the right way to go about sort of getting that help without putting the burden on the Jews of color. So, like, I guess how do you reckon with that? How would you reckon with that as a Jew of color who wants to say, yeah, screw you, figure it out, but also wait, you're taking that step to ask?
Yeah. And I think that's the biggest part in what we talk about is asking in not exactly the right way, but like the burden absolutely should not just be on JOCs to fix racism within the Jewish community. Obviously, that takes us all. JOCs are poised in a specific position since we are at the intersection of anti-Semitism and racism. And experience both, and how to navigate through that in a way that, when articulated, is incredibly powerful. I think that only we know our own experiences, and JOCs across have varying levels of experience with, racism in the Jewish community. But I'm trying to put this into the correct words. And maybe I should not be as correct about it. JOCs are typically used as kind of a tokenized addition to community, and saying like, oh, look, we have them.
Now that's so cringy, but yeah, but it happens. Like, we know it. I think anybody listening to this has seen it happen. Hopefully they haven't been part of it, but like, this is the reality for the JOC community, though.
Yeah. And I think the thing is that our reality has been silenced and questioned for so many years and is just starting that conversation back up. And so actually having JOCs, and like I said, who want to lead, there are some JOCs, and this is, I think, the difference of if you are in a Jewish communal space, going up and asking me, can you read Hebrew? Or like, do you understand what this book says? Is not the correct way to do that. But there are times
that you have to spell that out as just insanity.
Yeah, but I think that there are things like Edot, like Jews in All Hues, so many JOC organizations that are there to answer questions. Mm-hmm. And understanding the boundary between like what I can personally take on and the work that I can do and like the trauma that going into Jewish spaces has for me, and like being very aware about all of that.
It's difficult stuff. It's emotional. Yeah. It's I'm sure emotionally draining for you. I'm asking questions that probably is certainly not my intention, but like watching you answer them, I think probably puts you back in those uncomfortable spaces. Yeah. And that's certainly not the intention. It's really, I'm interested in so your experience and how those experiences have informed your practice of I guess Judaism in general, but your focus on racial justice and racial equity.
It's not necessarily something that I chose, to be honest. I got really fucking fed up experiencing racism, particularly at my home synagogue. And then as I had joined NIFTY growing up, experiencing it across the country. And for me, I had talked to so many people about it. I had bitched to so many people about it. I was done. And I felt super helpless. And so it caused me to really understand and get invested in like how this is viewed and the work that needs to be done in the Jewish community. I'd also say that it has a lot to do with my mom.
Right.
And for me being adopted, so I have white parents.
Okay.
And that's been a really long conversation about my mom growing up in the 50s and her experiencing huge amounts of anti-Semitism. And, talking about her experiences with Judaism and how she relates to it versus how I relate to it. And her understanding that she doesn't identify as anything but Jewish. She doesn't identify as white. She purely identifies as Jewish. And for her to get to the point of understanding that, like, I am also Jewish, but I experience that in a very different way than she has, and she does.
Did she grow up in Minneapolis?
She grew up in Brooklyn.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, because I was in Minneapolis at that time was incredibly anti-Semitic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But to experience it in New York is sort of fascinating in that same way. But it gets interesting to hear, sort of how your mother experienced it and how she sort of views herself, and then how you experienced it, but for very different reasons, being adopted from South Korea. I think it's the people who, I'm sure that it's the people who looked at you and you're like, you're Asian, you can't be Jewish.
That somebody literally said that on a NIFTY bus ride back as we were watching Mean Girls. And the part when Gretchen at the end joins like
the Vietnamese. Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so somebody on the bus was just like, she can't do that. She's Jewish. And I was like, but
hi, look at me. God.
And like, to be honest, I got really pissed and like tired of everything. And so I just started doing my own work, and that led to me being hired by Edot.
Which I think is sort of it's interesting because Edot, for people who don't know, is the Midwest Regional Jewish Racial Justice Collaborative. And it's so interesting that almost despite the experiences you had in Jewish spaces growing up, which sounded pretty awful, and I think I'm underselling it a little bit, that you still end up in that space working for Edot, and you're on the board of JCA, that you keep sort of getting drawn into at least some version of a Jewish space, even if I mean, neither of those are what I would call necessarily traditional Jewish spaces. Mm-hmm. But you get drawn, but you just sort of keep getting sucked back into those spaces, which is, it's interesting to me.
And I think that definitely I've talked with other JOCs and there are some that, like, for me, I was like, I'm going to be the best and I'm going to do everything that I can so that nobody can question it. And that, like, if no other JOC has to experience what I've experienced, then, like, if I can take the brunt of it and, like, move things forward in a way that doesn't have to affect the generations to come, that's what I'll do. Like, I feel in a certain amount of responsibility, even when I was younger, that, like, and this happened with, like, Nifty Regional Board. I'm like, no one can question my Jewishness if I'm up on at the front. And so it's also a little bit of perfectionism and, like, wanting to do everything at once. But it's very much of, you know, for JCA, this is the first official JOC cohort that they've had with the three of us, Dylan and Deanna, who are on there as well. And that's kind of the thing of, like, if there is a chance that the children after this don't have to experience this and affect not only their relationship with the Jewish community, but, like, relationship with Hashem, like, then absolutely, I'm going to do everything that I can, including taking in all of this trauma so that they don't have to.
That just feels like so much for one person to bear. Like, how do you sit with that on your shoulders all the time? Like, that would just feel so hard to me.
Yeah. And I think that's a part of this, the racial equity work is, like, and I think activism in general is there is a huge burnout culture. When I was at Powder Run Encampment or at GFS or at Winsway, you know, there's this idea of, like, you got to be in it as much as you can until, like, you're sleeping there, until you're doing, like, and there isn't a thought about balance and what that looks like because we haven't created it in our communities. And that's something I'm really grateful for Shahana, who's the founder and exec of Edot, is she values self-care so highly. And that, like, in this work, if you're going to be doing this work, you have to take care of yourself. And again, the internet has done amazing things for connecting JOCs together and for us to realize that there are so many of us out there. And so, like, we get to be 100% Jewish, but we also get to find and do these things that are incredibly healing. Like with Mayyim Hayyim, all of that ritual and story creation is, you know, the basis of that is relationship building and healing. And what does healing look like through Mikveh, specifically for Jewish women of color? And so I think being able to put it in a different context of, you can feel this, you can do it, you can do it all the time. But if there's no one to tell you that, like, you need a break, then that's when you need a break. So, like, my job professionally, like, full-time, is a social worker with Red Lake Nation. They're children and family services here on the urban team. But then I get to also be a part of Shir Tikva's racial justice work, be a part of Edot and plan programs with them, be a part of Mayyim Hayyim. There are other ways that I get to feel like something is happening, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
And that there are other ways that I can plug into the community that are on my own terms.
That I would think would be good for the self-care, is, you know, that you don't have to be on all the time in Jewish spaces. You can sort of dip in and out when you're what your mental health or your psyche or, what have you sort of allows it.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. It's good that you have that ability.
Yeah, definitely. Again, not every place does, and places definitely need it.
Yes, that is true.
Yeah, I think there's also just a level of understanding. Like I said, all JOCs have different experiences, but we have a thing that, we can all relate to, and that we understand that we're a part of this other community too, that we get to find a lot of solace in that necessarily like the traditional Jewish community hasn't given us.
Well, how do you, I guess, do you just take it? Like, do you just find that space to, if the traditional Jewish community hasn't given it to you, do you just sort of carve out your own space that works for you and how you want to practice and observe and build relationships?
I think this question is a little complicated because I don't really attend synagogue anymore. And I don't know if this is, but because of the racism that I was experiencing, I think that 100%, I think this speaks to a diversity of tactics, if that makes sense, of, do you take it or do you work in traditional ways of like getting hired and do this work and paid to do this work and like do it in the program style? And I think that there's room for both. I think that we are at a point where people are not able to really ignore what we're saying and what we're wanting out of a community. I think there's also time for us to do trainings and lead those trainings. And I also purely believe that there is a time to smash it down.
So, okay, so you do emotional work in like several different jobs we've that you've touched on. How do you unplug? How do you get your mind off of all of these really heavy, challenging, difficult, uncomfortable, occasionally awful things?
I love to cook. Like I mentioned earlier, I foster dogs.
Okay.
So that's just, I like being around puppies. I have planned out my camping season this year, but I think like every day today is really my morning routine of like getting up and making coffee and stretching and like having some time and solace to myself.
Okay. So you mentioned your camping season is planned out already. It's the first week of March. Where do you like to camp?
State parks.
Okay. You have a favorite?
Yes. Probably Bearhead Lake.
Okay.
Always go to Bearhead Lake State Park every year. I've slowly been moving around to different ones, and I'm hitting up a Wisconsin one this year, but Bearhead Lake State Park in Itasca.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, you're cheating on Minnesota with Wisconsin?
I know, but it's so pretty. If you look at the pictures there, they're so pretty.
I know. It's true. Well, I mean, it's great. At least, you have some ways to sort of to unplug, to walk away.
Yeah. And I think there's also one thing that I have been told growing up is that I'm just very angry.
I don't get that sense.
Thank you. But I think it's also been learning about like how and when anger can happen in situations, and like being able to be okay with like being angry about these really big things and being upset about these really big things. And that anger can absolutely be a really productive force. And I think just coming to terms with that, of like how angry I was as a kid and as a teenager, and like, yes, I'm only 28, but like realizing that like there are ways that I can move that and put that into something. Like whether it's like going out on the streets for protests or whether it's like writing a curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's good that you've found ways to channel that. I'm sorry that you got pegged as angry. I mean, I'm guessing, like, based on some of the stories you've been telling from your adolescence, there's been perfectly good reasons to be angry.
Yeah.
I mean, those come
absolutely.
from a place. Those don't come out of nothing.
Yes, definitely. And I think it's a larger learning and understanding that has been gained is that we are angry for a reason. I am angry for a reason that these things have happened. And I think that they're finally being, on some level, listened to, which hasn't happened before. And I've been described as angry because I've been that person like shouting, being like, why hasn't this gotten better? And so
again, it's from a place. I mean, it's you're shouting for a reason, though. Again, it's not just because you have anger issues. There are things that sounds like there are things that caused it.
yeah. We just did a program on Sunday with Edot with a JOC teen author who's Chicago based. And the way that, and she published a book for the Jewish community about her multicultural identity. Mm. Talking to her at 16 years old is kind of insane about like how well she is able to like be so eloquent about where she is with her identity and have it like not have it figured out, because none of us ever really do, but for her to feel so secure. And that is something that, even though she did what a lot of us do, is that if it isn't created, we're going to build it.
But I think it's admirable, and it's both admirable and unfortunate that there are so many things and so many spaces that have to be created specifically by JOCs because they were never created before. Like it's trying to create this new normal.
Absolutely. And I think that like the Jewish people have always been a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial identity. And for that to only be starting to actually realize and like be accepted is super important. Obviously, we have a shit ton of work to do, but they didn't exist because, well, I'm not going to make a blanket statement like that. It's absolutely imperative that synagogues and Jewish spaces do this work, but also I don't think we've had a choice.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest thing is we haven't had a choice, and that like we had to build it because it wasn't created. And going a little off topic, I am finishing up a grant project from JOCI, and it's talking about specifically how synagogues and Jewish institutions are not prepared to do like a reconciliation or address this work because there aren't the systems in our synagogues or in our communities that actually have been created to address it.
Within the Twin Cities or more globally?
More globally. Okay. There aren't really, if there are racial incidents that happen, this is something that I found is like, we all talk about it in the JOC community. Mm-hmm. We all talk amongst each other, but, and that I think is something is that like if incidents happen, synagogues don't always have the correct, especially when it deals with race, don't have the correct way to address how healing happens that centers JOCs. And I think that's a larger conversation.
No, I think it's a much larger conversation, and probably not the time to launch into it. But I definitely, it's a conversation that I think should be had, and we should talk about more at a later date about how to sort of put the idea out there that synagogues aren't equipped and they need to be, and why. Like, I think that's that is a worthy conversation to have, but probably down the road.
Yeah.
Which is fair. All right. So we're gonna end. We've had very, very heavy topics. So we're going to go a complete 180 into the borderline nonsense that we end on each episode. First, what is your favorite Jewish food?
Kasha Varnikas.
Okay. I'm not familiar with this.
It is food that let me see. I grew up on, yeah. You may recognize it.
I don't. It's too far. The screen is too far away. Okay, this is not great audio. What Sarah is doing is Googling it and showing me. Oh, okay, yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Now you got it close enough. Now I know what it is. But yeah, this is not great audio, people. We're sorry, but
sorry.
Yes. Okay. What is you answered that exceptionally quickly. What is it about? No, which is great. Look, you're a woman who knows what they want. What is it that? What is it about this that is sparked such a response?
It's probably one of the Jewish foods that I had growing up, like very consistently. That wasn't like just for holidays. That wasn't just like my mom would make a giant batch and it'd be in our fridge and like accessible. And it's just so good that like, for me, it brings up everything wonderful about my Jewish childhood. And like,
that's great.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about Jewish food is because I think most food does this, but because the Jewish community is the community with which I do so much in, the memories of food just do so much for just for the memory and just the connecting and what it brings you back to.
Absolutely.
And finally, what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
Shabbat.
You do you really do like the just put everything away and totally unplug for the 24 hours?
No, that would cause me an anxiety attack.
Fair enough. Listen, I think me too. So I understand that. Well, what is it about Shabbat?
The intentionality of it, of having each week and understanding like this is an end and we're going to start off on a new beginning with Havdalah, and like just every week understanding that it comes again.
Yeah. But
you're separating things out with this beautiful, beautiful ritual and understanding.
That is beautiful. It is, it's interesting. I think I get the answer of Shabbat a lot, but I think the reasons are all different, and it's which is great, seems very Jewish. That it's the same answer on its face, but then once you dig a little bit, it's a completely different reason.
Yeah. To be honest, I like making challah, and I like the time that it takes to make challah.
For sure.
And that for me is something like on Fridays, starting at like 10 a.m. to like get the bread ready to proof to like 5 p.m. all in it. It's something that just like brings me back to my Judaism so hardcore.
As a challah baker, I totally appreciate that also. Well, Sara Greenhalgh, thank you so much. We'll have the links to all of your various projects in the show notes so people can learn more about them and about you and the work you do. But thank you so much for joining me this week. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.